Hey friends, it's Alex from Vulture Culture and welcome to Fundamentals of EQ. In this series, I'm going to show you what EQ is, how to use it, and why it's the most important tool in any mixer's arsenal. Before we get started, please like this video and subscribe to the channel if you want to see all of the tutorials in this series. In these videos, I'm going to be using ReaEQ, which is Reaper's stock EQ plugin, but you could use whatever plugin is in your DAW. The reason I'm going to be using ReaEQ is because if you go to reaper.fm/ReaPlugs, you can download ReaEQ, which is right here, and you don't even need to be using Reaper. And it's great. It's free, but I highly recommend you use Reaper because not only is it probably the best DAW on the planet right now, it's also free to try for 2 months, and it is only $60 if you're a casual user like myself. I think to buy the commercial license, you need to be making quite a lot of money off of it. So anyways, I would recommend you use Reaper, but you could use whatever plugin you'd like. It doesn't really matter. This video is an introduction to what EQ is, and also just some basic terms to go over what is in an EQ plugin. First off, let's talk about what EQ is. EQ is familiar to a lot of us, even if we're not used to working in studios, and that's because our cars have EQs built in. So a lot of us are familiar with either turning up the bass in our car stereo systems or turning up the high end. So if I'm playing this track, which is Black and Gray, it's a new song by my group Vulture Culture, and I turn up the high end, you can hear the highest frequencies in the song go higher, and same thing if I turn up the bass. You can really start pushing it. And EQ is a whole way that you can shape a sound dramatically, if you want, or in subtle ways to make certain frequencies more intelligible, emphasize certain frequency ranges. And it's by far the most important tool when you're mixing, because mixing is all about balance, and tonal balance is achieved with really good use of EQ. And the difference between a recording that sounds like it was recorded in your mom's basement and something that's on the radio is mostly EQ. The biggest thing that EQ is not is anything that's going to affect the dynamics of a sound. So if I play this again, you'll notice that as I move this filter around, the overall sense of impact in the song doesn't change much, and that's because I'm not making anything hit harder or softening any of the dynamics. It's purely just affecting the tonal balance. Now, to a certain extent, if I boost around the snare frequency, let's say I add a lot to around 200, now every time the snare hits, there's a little bit more thump versus this. But that's not truly affecting the dynamics. I'm not making the snare hit harder. It's just louder in that frequency. So every time it does hit, it's harder. The thing about EQ that's very important is learning how to use tasteful amounts of EQ and not overdo it, because I think that's probably the number one beginner mistake. And then the sophomore mistake is then being too tame with it. And I see this a lot, people advising on the internet, never boost or cut more than 3 decibels or 4 decibels. And that's totally true if you have an awesome recording from a fantastic multi-million-dollar studio. But if you're recording your own band or something else, there's plenty of times you would do quite more dramatic EQ than that. Before we get into anything too much, let's talk about the 3 main controls here on any EQ plugin you'd be using. And regardless of what type of filter you're using, whether it's a parametric or it's a shelf or it's a filter or a bunch of other stuff that we'll talk about, it's going to have a frequency number. Right now, it's around 1K, which is 1,000 hertz. And as I move this around, you can see down here we have 50, 100, 200, 300, 500. So if I knew I wanted to boost, for instance, you can see that there's kind of some sibilance up here in my voice. You can see that if I boosted here, you would hear more of that. And if I was to cut some of that out, I would start to sound a little muted. Which brings us to our next function, which is gain in decibels. And you can see that as I lower, take about 10 decibels out of 7.5K hertz, that's what it sounds like. And if I do the opposite, it gets very thin sounding. And that's important because it's so critical that you are adding or subtracting. That's all EQ does. And bandwidth is interesting. So I'm going to move this back to about 1000. So if I boost here, you can see it's got a nice wide curve. So at the center here is where most of the EQ is affecting the signal, but it's affecting even some of the stuff down here and some of it up here. If I narrow this, now, if I bring it all the way down, it almost doesn't sound like it's doing anything, but you can hear that it's ringing a little bit. And if I, now you can hear that middle frequency is being boosted. But if I was to do the opposite and really expand this out, at some point, it kind of starts to become almost like it's the entire track. And you can do this too, where now there's really only the lowest part of my voice and the highest part of my voice, that very radio announcer sound. And bandwidth will affect everything, and you can see it's in octaves here, whether it's a parametric EQ or filter or anything like that. It's important to be familiar with these. If I didn't say it before, frequency, hertz is how many cycles a second a sound does. All sound is upward and downward motion of your speaker, which is being driven by a magnet. And how often that happens determines the sound you're listening to. And the lower the frequency, obviously the lower the sound. So if I'm down here around 50 hertz, I can really boost the sub bass of my voice. And if I sweep this all the way up, and you can hear all the way into the air above my voice. So there's this very hissy sound right up at the top. And that's it for this video. So please like this video if you found it helpful, and subscribe to the channel to see all of the tutorials, and I'll see you in the next video.